Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women in Nazi Germany. During World War II, thousands of women found themselves trapped in a place where death was not the worst fate that could befall them, a place where hunger, torture, and inhuman medical experiments were part of the daily routine. For 130,000 prisoners, that place was a reality, Ravensbrück. Of these, 90,000 never managed to leave that hell alive. The Ravensbrück concentration camp was initially created for the enemies of Hitler's regime. The Germans needed a place for special prisoners, spies, political detainees, rebels, agents of the Special Operations Executive under the orders of Great Britain, fighters of the French resistance, Polish aristocrats, and Scandinavian nationals. Academics and scholars who openly supported socialism or communism were imprisoned here. Criminals or individuals whom the Nazis considered social outcasts, for example the disabled, the mentally ill, prostitutes or lesbians, were also incarcerated. In 1933, Germany entered a period of terror when Adolf Hitler assumed power. Shortly thereafter, mass arrests of his political opponents began. Those considered enemies of the state and of the German nation were sent to prisons or concentration camps. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. The first camps, Dachau and Oranienburg, were created in the first year following Adolf Hitler's rise to power. The first German concentration camp for women was organized at the same time in Moringen, in the Nordheim district. From there, the women were transferred to the prison at Lichtenberg, near Torgau. At first, the inmates were communists, social democrats, and Jews. Later, followers of various religions joined them, including Catholics, Bible students, that is, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Protestants, as well as homosexual men and women. After the outbreak of the war, the entire operational system of the network of concentration camps was extended to the occupied countries. When the women's camp at Lichtenberg began to run out of space, it was decided to construct a new camp. Heinrich Himmler chose a site near Ravensbrück, a village located in the picturesque lake district of Mecklenburg, with its lakes of Röblensee, Barlensee, and Schwetzsee, about 80 kilometers from Berlin and not far from Fürstenberg. This was a location in an area of natural beauty. Himmler believed that the cleansing of the German blood should begin close to nature, and the invigorating forces of the German forests played a central role in the mythology of the Heimat, the German homeland. The proximity to Berlin was also important, as it allowed Himmler to frequently visit for inspections. The same applied to the location of the men's camp at Sachsenhausen, only 45 kilometers from Ravensbrück. It was the inmates of Sachsenhausen who, in November of 1938, began working on the construction of a camp for women. In this video, we will present the history of the women's camp KL Ravensbrück based on the accounts of surviving women. One of the inmates, Maria Moldenhauer, divided the history of this place into periods. The first of these covers the years 1939 to 1941, when the camp was constructed and inaugurated, and the first transport of women arrived. It was the foundational period, a time when the grass and the flower beds around the prisoners' barracks were maintained with great care. The streets were swept, and the barracks were very clean. During this period, transports of Polish women arrived at KL Ravensbrück. The characteristic feature of the first period, wrote Maria Moldenhauer, is that the so-called German methods of education in relation to a conquered nation were fully applied. They mainly consisted of erasing a person's individual identity and self-confidence, causing them to lose their ambitions and willingness to respond to insults. Inciting class and national hatreds, fostering distrust, and the willingness to denounce others were also part of the program. The second period, spanning from 1941 to 1944, was described by Maria Moldenhauer as follows. Gradually, in the second half of 1941, and in both 1942 and 1943, a Polish community began to form in the camp. As workers, the Polish women enjoyed the trust of the authorities. At the beginning of this period, the original disciplinary methods were still in force, but the harassment became relatively less intense. However, there was a clear increase in the harsh and tragic consequences of the orders from the central authorities, which were strictly enforced by the camp authorities, in contrast to the previous makeshift methods of torment. These included executions by firing squad of Polish women brought from prisons, the initiation of medical experiments, the persecution of Bible students and of communists, searches of the barracks to detect political conspiracies, the sending of prisoner transports to munitions factories, the dispatching of the sick and the demented to be executed by firing squad, and the recruitment of women to work in the brothels for German soldiers. The main supervisors were Johanna Langerfeld, Maria Mandl, Anna Klein-Plaubel, and Louisa Brunner. Their assistants helped them carry out their duties. One of them was Dorothea Binz, known for her brutal treatment of the women. The first transport, composed of 867 women, arrived at Ravensbrück on the 15th of May, 1939. Upon arrival, the women received their camp numbers, were stripped, washed, and depilated. The vast majority were Polish. The first to arrive on the 23rd of September, 1939, were residents from both German lands and the former Polish territories incorporated into the Third Reich, Silesia, Pomerania, Lubuschland, and East Prussia. The first 5 women from Western Poland arrived at the camp on the 2nd of November. Large transports of Polish women began to arrive at Ravensbrück starting in April of the following year. The most significant year in this regard was 1944, when more than 16,000 new inmates appeared in the camp, of which about 12,000 came from insurgent Warsaw. That same year, some women were brought to Ravensbrück from Auschwitz. It is estimated that about 40,000 Polish women passed through the Ravensbrück camp, but the exact number is impossible to determine, as many documents have been destroyed and those that have survived contain some gaps. In addition to the Polish women, the camp housed 18,000 Russian women, 8,000 French women, 1,000 Dutch women, as well as women of British, German, Jewish, and Gypsy origin. In total, about 130,000 women were forced to live in this place of torment, in complete overcrowding and subjected to experiments. Upon arrival, each inmate was marked with a triangle, a simple patch of cloth that was to be sewn onto the left sleeve of her jacket. The color black denoted women classified in the category of a social, that is, prostitutes, petty thieves, and lesbians. Green signified professional criminals, red was reserved for political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses wore a purple triangle, and Jewish women a yellow one. One of those who wore a red triangle was Zofia Tchaikovska. Born on the 22nd of December, 1910, she was a teacher in Sandomierz. She arrived at Ravensbrück on the 21st of August, 1940, and remained there until the end, that is, until April 1945. According to her own account, she was imprisoned as an undesirable fugitive. She arrived at Ravensbrück on a transport of about 130 people. The journey lasted 4 days and 4 nights. Upon arriving at the camp, the women formed lines in front of the bathhouse and were led inside. First, they had to surrender all their belongings, including jewelry and money. After the bath, they underwent a medical examination. Their heads were shaved, without exception. The Ravensbrück camp was systematically expanded, although it still retained a rectangular shape. It was surrounded by a wall of 4 meters in height, topped with electric wires, and patrolled around by SS sentries with dogs. Initially, the camp was prepared to accommodate 15,000 inmates. Its expansion was related to the growing number of women. A survivor, Wanda Jarzyka, recalls, "At the time of my arrival at the camp, the number of inmates exceeded 30,000, and in the winter months it apparently rose to 42,000. These figures refer only to the main camp, the so-called Old Camp. The majority were Polish women, but besides them there were women of all European nationalities. I even saw 2 black women. The living conditions in the women's camp were as severe as those in the men's camp. The inmates got up every day at 4 in the morning. They washed themselves, got dressed, made their beds, and received a cup of black coffee. Then they went out and lined up for roll call. The camp's food was miserable. At noon, the ration was 3/4 of a liter of soup, the so-called Eintopf, a mixture of various vegetables with a little fat or remnants of meat. Dinner consisted of a little soup, or possibly 3 or 4 potatoes, and a leaf of lettuce. At dinner, the inmates also received 200 or 250 grams of bread as an allocation for the following day. On Sundays or holidays, they could have 100 grams of margarine, some cheese, or 50 grams of sausages. The women worked both in the camp and outside of it. They worked on road construction, tree felling, drainage works, loading and unloading of trains, leveling uneven roads, various types of agricultural labor, animal husbandry, and the care of plants and flowers. Some of them worked for the German company Siemens, whose factory was located 1.5 kilometers from the camp. Siemens had 20 production halls there, and the women of Ravensbrück were forced to perform hard labor there from the summer of 1942. The factory produced parts for radios and telephones, so the work of the inmates required accuracy and precision. The women worked beyond their strength. They were only allowed to use the bathroom at designated times. To use it outside of that schedule, they needed a note from a doctor. The work in winter was especially harsh. Since they wore light clothing without gloves or scarves, the skin on their hands and face cracked from freezing. The conditions were not much better in summer. The heavy dresses and uncomfortable shoes made physical work in the heat difficult. Deprived of water, they died of exhaustion. The authorities intended to destroy us with these harsh conditions. It was perfectly deliberate. The supervisors themselves said that it would be a waste to use a bullet on us. The conditions themselves would destroy us, asserted Zofia Tchaikovska. Starting from 1939, a program was launched for the physical elimination of the mentally ill and the intellectually disabled in the form of an operation codenamed T4. The number of people killed merely for having been, for example, in psychiatric hospitals is difficult to calculate. The Operation 14F13 was carried out as part of that program. This codename, taken from correspondence with the commanders of the concentration camps, concealed the murder of camp inmates with disabilities, the mentally ill, and those incapable of performing hard and exhausting labor for the German industry. Due to the systematic increase in the number of camp inmates, the SS decided to select the sick, the weak, or those incapable of performing hard and exhausting labor for the German industry, whom they labeled as racially defective and eliminated by gassing them with carbon monoxide in gas chambers. In the case of Ravensbrück, the first transport of selected prisoners left the camp on the 4th of February, 1942. Attracted by the promise of being transferred to other camps, they did not suspect that they were going to die. Bernhard Strebel determined that the total number of women executed in Operation 14F13 was 1,600. These were sent to the gas chamber of the Bernburg Treatment and Care Center. In the lists of women sent from Ravensbrück, there were not only those who were disabled or incapable of work, but also women with tuberculosis, asthmatics, asocial individuals with venereal diseases, as well as healthy women classified as criminals. The death certificates issued to the relatives of the victims by the registry office contained false information about the place and date of death. For example, Ravensbrück was recorded as the place of death. The records of the inmates, on the other hand, were annotated with a general note stating transferred to another camp. Bernhard Strebel could not determine where the men from Ravensbrück were taken, although it is assumed that, as in the case of the women, they died in the gas chamber of Bernburg. In the second phase of Operation 14F13, in 1943 to 1944, the inmates were murdered in the gas chamber of the Hartheim Castle Care Center, near Linz in Austria. According to eyewitnesses, about 60 of the black transports, as the inmates called them, left Ravensbrück camp. Between 50 and 70 women were transported on each one. At the same time, the camp authorities tightened the selection criteria, focusing primarily on the mentally ill. The rest, since they could work, were sent to industrial plants. From 1942 to 1944, experiments of this kind were carried out on inmates. The German military command was impatient with the slowness of treating the German soldiers wounded at the war front. Several medical experiments were carried out with women from Ravensbrück to find new ways of treating wounds. The women were deliberately wounded, infected with bacteria, and then observed. They were also administered several courses of medication to control and evaluate their effects on health. The medical experiments were conducted on young and often healthy individuals. No one asked for their opinion or permission. They did not know why they were being taken to the operating room. In general, these treatments consisted of infecting the wounds and controlling the effectiveness of the sulfonamides. An incision was made in the leg of the women, and subsequently, various germs were injected into them. For example, bacteria causing gas gangrene and tetanus, Staphylococcus aureus, which produced an infection. Additionally, various materials were applied to the wounds. For example, pieces of glass, wood or paper, thus simulating the conditions that could occur on the front during the war. Plaster was applied to the infected legs. Some women were given sulfonamides, while others were given no medication. Another treatment was to break or cut the bone and then transplant it from one leg to the other. In this way, bone regeneration was observed, and finally the excision of sections of the muscles and nerves of the lower limbs. The interrogations and punishments imposed on the inmates for supposed infractions were as severe in their effects as the medical experiments. One of these offenses was attempting to smuggle any amount of food, however small, into the camp. Helping in escape attempts was punished even more severely, as happened to Elżbieta Kwieciała, who was detained on the 19th of April, 1943, and accused of helping 2 Polish women to escape. She was interrogated by Ludwig Ramdor, famous in the camp for organizing a secret network of collaborators among the inmates. They needed to know what the women talked about and what they planned when they were alone in the barracks. Commander Fritz Suren and Commissar Ludwig Ramdor imposed upon Elżbieta Kwieciała a sentence of 15 weeks of confinement. It was a cell with a dark window, without ventilation. The interrogations were held mostly at night. She spent the first 8 days without eating, sleeping on the floor naked. After 8 days, she received 250 grams of bread and half a liter of black coffee. She was also tortured. As she herself testified, the method of torture was as follows. They forced her to squat and handcuffed her hands behind her knees, put a leather belt around her neck, and pulled on it until her hands were tied. Then they brought her 6 blankets and placed them over her head. At the bottom, the edges of those blankets were carefully rolled up so that very little air could enter. The windows were sealed tightly and darkened. They kept her in that position for 3 hours, until she lost consciousness. She spent 11.5 months in the penal bunker, of which 15 weeks in the dark room. She went hungry for 19 weeks, received 25 lashes, and was tortured twice by strangulation and drowning, and additionally spent a total of 80 hours in hearings. However, if this happened to those who collaborated with the inmates, the Germans decided to leave public examples of what happened to those who attempted to escape from the camp. There were cases of suicide in the camp, committed by throwing oneself onto high-tension cables, testified Maria Moldenhauer years later. To scare away the others, the body was left hanging from the cables for several days and was officially shown to the inmates. The block where the suicide occurred was punished, and in the case of a failed attempt, the woman would go to the bunker after recovering and be beaten. These accounts offer a terrible picture of the living conditions in the camps. Hard work, starvation rations, severe punishments, medical experiments, and interrogations, all of this made it easier for the inmates to go insane. At first, those who died in the camp were cremated in the municipal crematorium of Fürstenberg. In 1943, the SS ordered the construction of a crematorium outside the camp premises, which was expanded 1 year later. In the vicinity, there was a barrack that had previously served as a warehouse. At the beginning of 1945, it was converted into a gas chamber. Meanwhile, the Uckermark camp for young inmates became an extermination camp. Towards the end of the war, the elderly and the sick were sent there. After the war, Kazimiera Wardzinska testified that on the 22nd of January 1945, about 1,500 inmates were sent there from Ravensbrück. In the following days, this number increased to 4,000, and a little later another 2,500 were taken there. The women were lured there with promises of relaxation after very hard work, although the reality turned out to be very different. Life in Uckermark was hell. Instead of working, the women were subjected to a strict selection. The thinnest, the overweight, the elderly or the disabled were chosen. During the selection they were pushed and beaten, and afterwards, once the list was made, they were locked in a barrack. At dusk, a truck would come to pick them up, and they were again beaten and pushed. They were thrown into the back of the vehicle and hung by their arms and legs. The truck took the women to the gas chamber located next to the Ravensbrück camp and immediately returned for the next batch. After 15 minutes, the bodies of the victims were transferred from the gas chamber to the crematorium. Tongues of fire emerged from the chimneys and could be seen from the camp barracks for days. Maria Kaminska remembered this gloomy place after the war. She was transferred there in the beginning of January 1945. She confirmed that that camp, initially intended for young inmates, ended up becoming a place where the elderly and the sick were sent, and from there they were transported to the gas chambers. That camp was full of seriously ill individuals. Whoever arrived there did not leave. The exact number of women who died in Ravensbrück is as difficult to determine accurately as the number of inmates evacuated from the camp by the Swedish Red Cross. It is estimated that about 92,000 women died. It was also said that the mortality rate in the camp was 70%, which means that about 132,000 women passed through Ravensbrück. Bernhard Strebel has a slightly different opinion on this matter. In his view, the figure of 92,000 fatal victims given by the British prosecutor in the first Hamburg trial of the Ravensbrück personnel was determined in an overly superficial manner and was not supported by documents. But does the exact number of dead really matter? The survivors believe that names are more important than figures. The Polish women who died in Ravensbrück are commemorated by a plaque discovered on the 19th of June, 1997, in a museum established there in honor of the victims. Before the trials of the Ravensbrück personnel were held, the doctors who conducted criminal medical experiments on people during the war were tried in Nuremberg. Before the first American military tribunal in the period from the 9th of December, 1946, to the 19th of August, 1947. The majority of them were sentenced to death. From the end of the war until 1948, 7 trials were held in Ravensbrück. The first of these took place from the 5th of December, 1946, to the 3rd of February, 1947, against 16 camp officials. Among them were Ludwig Ramdor, Rolf Rosenthal, Gerhard Schidlowski, Dorothea Bintz, and Percival Treiter. After the trial, 11 death sentences were carried out by hanging. 4 sentences were given as prison terms of 10 to 15 years. All the death sentences were executed on the 2nd and 3rd of May, 1947, except for that of Dr. Percival Treiter, who committed suicide on the 8th of April. Fritz Suren was also to be tried, but he managed to escape. He was captured in 1949 and handed over to the French authorities. He was executed by firing squad on the 12th of July, 1950. The second trial of the Ravensbrück officials took place from the 5th to the 27th of November, 1947. The sole defendant was Friedrich Opitz, the SS man who ran one of the factories in which the inmates worked. He was sentenced to die by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the 26th of February, 1948. The third trial was that of the personnel of the Uckermark extermination camp and took place from the 14th to the 28th of April, 1948. It concerned the people responsible for selecting the women who were to be sent to the gas chambers and for mistreating them. Of the 5 defendants, 3 were found guilty and 2 were acquitted for not having served in Uckermark during the period when it was an extermination camp. The 4th trial took place in May and June 1948 against 5 members of the Ravensbrück medical staff. One of them was Dr. Walter Sonntag, who was sentenced to die by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the 17th of November 1948. During the 5th trial of the Ravensbrück staff in June 1948, 3 SS men were accused of murdering camp inmates. All were found guilty of the charges. Arthur Conrad was sentenced to die by hanging, Walter Schenk to 20 years in prison and Heinrich Schäfer to 2 years. The problems of the concentration camp victims did not end with the cessation of hostilities in 1945. The victims created various organizations that aimed to raise awareness about the German crimes. The need to compensate the former inmates who had suffered as a result of the medical experiments became important. In a government meeting held on the 26th of July, 1951, the German authorities approved a resolution to provide aid to the victims of the inhuman experiments carried out in Ravensbrück. A committee was established to evaluate the proposals and determine the forms of compensation, which included funding for medical treatments, disability pensions, and financial compensations. But can money really repair the suffering? No resolution, however just it may seem, will be able to erase the unspeakable pain of the victims nor the void left in their families. The history of Ravensbrück is not only a reminder of horror, but also a warning of what must never be repeated.